No, she is my true fiancé, Julian Harrington declared firmly, his newly restored vision locking onto Dara Adebayo, the black woman who had stood by him in darkness, while Penelope Sinclair, the white blonde sister dressed in a bridal gown, recoiled in shock. As the bandages fell away in that tense hospital room, Julian's eyes pierced the deception that had bound them all. Dara forced to impersonate her adoptive sister and marry the blind millionaire she'd only known through phone calls laced with lies. But what began as a cruel family scheme blossomed into an unexpected love, challenging prejudices and revealing truths hidden in the shadows. Will Julian's sight shatter their fragile bond, or will it illuminate a path to genuine happiness? Where are you tuning in from today? Perhaps the bustling streets of New York, the sunny shores of Lagos, or somewhere unexpected. Share in the comments below and let me know your predictions for how this twists. If stories like this captivate you, hit that subscribe button for our latest videos and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next heart-stirring tale. In the dim glow of a lavish dressing room, where the air hung heavy with the cloying scent of expensive perfumes and the frantic whispers of assistants, Dara Adebayo stood frozen, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribcage. She was a shy young woman of African descent, her dark skin glistening under the harsh lights, her ebony curls hastily pinned beneath a veil that felt more like a shroud. For 6 long months, Dara had been ensnared in a web of deception, speaking to Julian Harrington over the phone under the guise of her adoptive sister, Penelope Sinclair. Penelope, with her porcelain skin and golden blonde hair, had deemed the romantic exchanges nonsensical drivel and shoved the duty onto Dara. Day after day, Dara had rehearsed, mimicking Penelope's lilting laugh, her clipped tone, even dousing herself in the same floral perfume that now made her stomach churn. It was all for this moment, this farce of a marriage to a blind millionaire who held the key to her family's financial salvation. No one had asked Dara if she wanted this. No one cared about the knot of terror twisting in her gut. Her adoptive mother, Eleanor Sinclair, gripped Dara's wrist with fingers like iron claws, her voice a venomous hiss that cut through the chaos. Penelope isn't coming. You have no choice. Walk down that aisle, or we'll all be begging on the streets. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and unyielding, bored into Dara's, leaving no room for protest. The room seemed to shrink around them, the clatter of heels on marble floors, the rustle of silk gowns, the insistent knocking of the wedding coordinator, all hammering against Dara's skull like a relentless storm. She opened her mouth, but her throat closed tight, words dying unspoken under the weight of that glare. Penelope lounged against the doorframe, arms crossed over her chest, her blonde locks cascading like a cascade of false sunlight. She offered only a single sentence, dripping with contempt. "You've always dreamed of being the bride, haven't you? Then play the part to the bitter end." Her smirk was a cruel curve, as if this were all a game, and Dara was merely a pawn to be sacrificed. The decision had been made long before this day. The dress, a glittering trap of lace and satin originally tailored for Penelope, was steamed and forced onto Dara's frame in a frantic 10 minutes. Makeup was slapped on in 6, shoes crammed onto her feet as the bridal car idled outside. Her name had been erased from the marriage license, replaced with Penelope's in a hasty forgery. And waiting at the altar was Julian Harrington, blind, wealthy, proud, a man handpicked by the Sinclairs as their golden ticket, too valuable to let slip away, too sightless to spot the switch. The cathedral loomed like a Gothic sentinel, its stained glass windows casting fractured rainbows across the pews filled with the elite. Press photographers with flashing cameras, socialites in designer gowns whispering behind gloved hands in a sea of curious eyes that judge without knowing the truth. Dara stepped into the aisle like a condemned soul marching to the gallows, the gown whispering against the stone floor with each hesitant step. The organ swelled in a triumphant melody, but to her it sounded like a dirge. Julian stood at the far end, a statue of composure in his tailored tuxedo, his dauntless posture betraying no hint of vulnerability. His blind eyes were half closed, head tilted ever so slightly, as if he were attuned to the symphony of sounds around him. The murmur of guests, the faint echo of footsteps, the subtle shift in the air as she approached. No one knew what churned in Julian's mind. Did he sense the deception? Could he feel the tremor in the atmosphere, the lie woven into every thread of this ceremony? The minister's voice boomed through the hallowed space. "Penelope Sinclair, do you take Julian Harrington to be your lawful husband, in honor, in love, and in duty, until death do you part?" The air turned to ice. Dara didn't dare look up. In the distance, she glimpsed Eleanor's single nod of approval, Penelope's smirk curling like a serpent's tail. Her voice cracked, barely audible. "I do." Julian tilted his head further, a pause hanging between them like a suspended breath. Then, in a voice low and intimate, meant only for her, "Why are you shaking? Are you afraid I'll see you?" For a fleeting second, Dara's blood ran cold. He wasn't joking. He had felt something, some invisible rift in the facade. Thunderous applause erupted. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her forced smile, not one of joy, but of survival. Penelope watched from the back row, her expression smug, as if she'd just won a vicious wager. Dara told herself it would only take a day, just enough to fool the crowd, sign the papers, and vanish from a life she was never meant to claim. But those words echoed in her mind like a poorly scripted line from a tragic play, failing to convince even her own racing heart. As the ceremony drew to a close, the organ's notes faded into echoes, and the guests rose in a wave of congratulations. Julian extended his arm, guiding her with a firmness that belied his blindness, his touch sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. The deception was sealed, the ring cold and heavy on her finger, a symbol not of love but of entrapment. Yet in that moment, as they stepped into the waiting car amid cheers and flashes, Dara couldn't shake the nagging whisper. What if the blind man saw more than anyone realized? The doors closed, shutting out the world, and the vehicle glided away from the cathedral's fading silhouette. But the abyss she had stepped into was only beginning, a darkness deeper than Julian's sightless world, where lies bloomed like poisonous flowers, waiting to unfurl. The Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through the dimly lit streets like a shadow slipping into the night, its engine a low, unobtrusive hum that did little to drown out the thunderous silence between them. Dara Adebayo sat rigid in the plush leather seat, her wedding gown pooling around her like a discarded dream. The cold ring on her finger, a constant reminder of the vow she'd uttered in deception. Beside her, Julian Harrington maintained his impeccable posture, hands interlaced in his lap, eyes closed as if in meditation. But Dara knew better. He wasn't sleeping. He was attuned to every nuance, every whisper of the world around him. The city lights blurred into smears through the tinted windows, fading as they ventured toward the northern outskirts, where the Harrington estate awaited, a secluded fortress of stone and secrets. As the car pulled up the winding driveway, gravel crunching softly under the tires, Dara's breath caught in her throat. The estate emerged from the darkness like a relic from another era. Tall spires piercing the sky, ivy clinging to weathered walls, and vast windows that stared blankly into the void. It wasn't a home, it felt like a meticulously curated gallery, designed by someone who navigated life through senses other than sight. The doors swung open on silent hinges, welcoming them with a rush of cool, sterile air. No warmth greeted her, no flicker of life. The lights were dimmed to a ghostly amber, casting long shadows that danced across marble floors. Flowers stood in vases, fresh yet scentless, as if their essence had been stripped away. Walls lined with black and white photographs captured abstract forms, landscapes perhaps, or forgotten memories. But not a single portrait dared to reveal a face. The butler, an elderly man with a bow as precise as a metronome, inclined his head. "Congratulations, madam." "Sir." His voice was a murmur, deferential and distant. Julian placed a hand lightly on Dara's back, guiding her forward with a touch that was both gentle and commanding. She felt the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her gown, a sensation that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. Intimate, yet impersonal. They moved into the dining room, where a long, endless table stretched like a barren runway, adorned only with two white porcelain plates. No flowers bloomed here. No candles flickered romantically. No music softened the edges of the void. It was a celebration in name only, stripped bare to its essentials. Julian took his seat at the head, gesturing for her to sit across from him. Dara lowered herself carefully, hands resting lightly on the gown that now felt like a costume ill-fitted to her soul. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint clink of silverware as servants placed dishes before them. Simple fare, elegantly presented but devoid of extravagance. She forced a bite, the food tasting bitter on her tongue, like ashes from a fire long extinguished. Julian ate methodically, every motion rehearsed, a symphony of precision born from years in darkness. Then, without warning, his voice cut through the quiet, soft as smoke, but sharp as shattered glass. Your voice. It's different. Dara flinched, her fork pausing midair. Different how, she managed, her heart racing as if caught in a spotlight. Softer, slower, a slight rasp at the end of your words. She didn't have that. His words hung in the air, accusatory yet curiously neutral, as if he were merely stating a fact from some internal ledger. She steadied herself, forcing a calm she didn't feel. Maybe I'm just tired. It's been a long day. The lie slipped out easily, but it felt heavy, like lead in her mouth. He nodded slowly, then inhaled deeply as if drawing secrets from the very molecules around them. And the perfume you're wearing, it's different too. Dara winced inwardly, cursing her oversight. In the rush of the morning, she'd forgotten to switch to Penelope's signature rose-scented elixir, opting instead for her own subtle vanilla blend. I forgot to put on the usual one, she stammered, her cheeks burning under his unseen scrutiny. Julian nodded again, saying nothing this time, but the air between them grew denser, charged with unspoken questions. Dinner dragged on in that oppressive silence, each bite a chore, each swallow a reminder of the charade she was trapped in. Dara's mind raced. Images of her adoptive mother and Penelope loomed like specters, their faces tight with satisfaction, eyes like surveillance cameras tracking her every slip. From now on, she would have to embody Penelope perfectly. No stumbles, no forgetting the details her sister had casually shared. Yet as she glanced at Julian, his face serene and unreadable, she wondered if the blind man before her was already piecing together the puzzle. When the meal finally ended, Dara attempted to rise, her legs unsteady beneath her, but Julian's voice stopped her cold. Do you remember our first phone call? He continued without waiting for a response, his tone casual, almost reflective. I told you about Paris, the way the Seine whispers at night. You told me about your cello, how its strings sang stories you couldn't put into words. She froze, the chair creaking faintly under her shifting weight. That conversation, it had been Penelope's domain before her sister grew impatient with what she called old-school romantic nonsense and delegated it to Dara midway through. Dara had stepped in seamlessly, or so she'd thought, but now the gaps in her knowledge yawned like chasms. Oh, right, she said, pressing her lips together to steady her voice. I said I wanted to open a bookstore by the lake, one with creaky floors and shelves full of forgotten tales. Julian tilted his head slightly, setting down his fork with deliberate care, his fingers brushing the napkin like the final note of a somber melody. No, he replied evenly. She never said that. The words landed like a blow, knocking the air from Dara's lungs. She stared into her water glass, wishing it held something stronger to numb the panic rising in her chest. How could he remember so precisely? The phone calls had blurred into one another for her, a script rehearsed under duress. But for him, they must have been lifelines in the dark, etched into memory with unerring clarity. It's fine, Julian added after a pause, his voice devoid of anger, but laced with something inscrutable. I have a very good memory, sometimes so good, it makes people uncomfortable. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer, as if the walls themselves were closing in to witness her unraveling. Julian rose then, his movements fluid and assured, extending a hand to help her up, a gentlemanly gesture that only heightened the tension. As they left the dining room, the butler's soft footsteps echoing behind them, Dara's mind whirled with dread. The estate, with its flawless but lifeless perfection, mirrored her predicament, beautiful on the surface, but hollow at its core. She had stepped into Julian's world, a realm of quiet precision where every sound, every scent, every hesitation was a revelation. And in that world, her disguise was already fraying at the edges, thread by fragile thread. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, leading to chambers unknown, but Dara felt the weight of the night pressing down. Julian's hand lingered a moment longer on her arm before releasing it, leaving her to navigate the uncertainty alone. In the dim light, she wondered, not for the first time, if the man who couldn't see was the only one truly perceiving the truth. The estate swallowed them whole, its silence a cocoon that promised no escape, only deeper entanglement in the web of lies that bound her to the stranger, this husband, this enigma. The bedroom enveloped them like a vast echoing cavern, its high ceilings lost in shadows that the dim bedside lamp could scarcely penetrate. Dara Adebayo lay on the edge of the king-sized bed, her body tense as a coiled spring, barely daring to breathe lest the slightest movement betray her. The sheets, crisp and cool against her skin, felt like a barrier rather than a comfort, separating her from Julian Harrington, who lay turned away on his side, his breathing steady and rhythmic in the oppressive quiet. The room was immaculate, wide and cold, with heavy drapes that muffled the outside world, and a space between the pillows that stretched like an unbridgeable gulf. Wind slipped through a cracked window, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from the garden below. But it did nothing to ease the chill settling in her bones. She stared at the ornate ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the plasterwork, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. Then, piercing the darkness like a blade, Julian's voice emerged, quiet, not directed at her explicitly, but resonant enough to slice through every inch of the space. "I don't need eyes to recognize a lie." The words hung there, heavy and unambiguous, sending a jolt through Dara's body. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs, wondering if he meant her, if this was the moment the facade crumbled. Was it a general musing, or had he sensed the deceit woven into her every word, her every hesitation? Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, falling silently onto the pillow as she bit her lip to stifle any sound. The scariest part wasn't the fear of exposure. It was the intimacy of being understood so thoroughly, stripped bare without a single glance. Sleep eluded her that night, a cruel phantom dancing just out of reach. Dara counted every shift in Julian's position, every subtle exhale, trying to decipher if he harbored hatred beneath that serene exterior. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air, her mind replaying the day's events in a torturous loop. The wedding vows uttered in falsehood, the dinner where his questions had probed like gentle fingers on a wound. Hours ticked by in agonizing slowness, marked only by the distant chime of a grandfather clock echoing through the estate. By the time dawn's first light filtered through the curtains, painting the room in pale grays, Dara felt exhausted, her body heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Julian stirred then, rising without a word, his movements precise and unerring as he navigated the room. He treated her with the same quiet courtesy as before. No accusations, no interrogations, just the routine of a husband greeting his wife. It was that normalcy that unnerved her most, a thin veil over what she suspected was a brewing storm. As morning unfolded, Dara forced herself to rise, determined to adapt to this new existence in Julian's meticulously ordered world. The estate awoke slowly, servants moving like ghosts through the halls, their footsteps hushed on the polished floors. She ventured into the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and marble where efficiency reigned supreme. Drawing from whispered tips from the staff, she prepared breakfast. Eggs poached to perfection, toast lightly buttered, coffee brewed strong and black, just as he preferred. Her hands trembled as she arranged the tray, but there was a strange solace in the task, a way to anchor herself amid the chaos of her thoughts. Carrying it to the sunroom, where shafts of light pierced the glass walls, she set it down with care, the clink of china echoing softly. Julian joined her shortly, guided by the faint aromas and the rhythm of her presence. They sat in companionable silence at first, the only sounds the sip of coffee and the distant bird song filtering in from the garden, But as the meal progressed, his questions resumed, subtle probes that chipped away at her defenses. "You once told me about orchids," he said casually, his fork pausing midair. "How they thrive in the shadows, blooming where others wither. Why don't you mention them anymore?" Dara's pulse quickened, her mind scrambling for a response. Orchids. That had been Penelope's fascination, a detail from those early phone calls before the burden shifted to her. She fumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. I, I suppose I've grown fond of other flowers lately, the simpler ones." It was a weak deflection, and she knew it, but Julian merely smiled faintly, a curve of his lips that didn't reach where his eyes might have sparkled if he could see. It was as if he were collecting these inconsistencies like puzzle pieces, assembling a picture she couldn't yet discern. Throughout the day, the pattern persisted. In the library, where shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound tomes, he asked about a book she'd supposedly recommended, a classic romance that Penelope had raved about, but Dara had never read. "What was it that drew you to it?" he inquired, his fingers tracing the spines with uncanny accuracy. She stammered through a vague summary pieced together from half-remembered conversations, her cheeks flushing with the effort. Again, no outburst, no demand for truth. Just that enigmatic nod, as if filing away another discrepancy. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a wall, thin and soft yet impenetrable, cold as frost on glass. By evening, as they retired once more to the bedroom, Dara's nerves were frayed to breaking. She lay there again, staring into the void, her body aching from the tension of the day. Julian's presence beside her was a paradox, comforting in its familiarity, terrifying in its perceptiveness. She wondered if he already knew, if this was a test of her endurance, a waiting game where he held all the cards. His silence wasn't indifference. It was a tacit acknowledgement of the deception, allowing her to stew in her guilt without forcing a confession. It left her in limbo, relieved that the axe hadn't fallen yet, tormented by the anticipation. In those sleepless hours, Dara began to grasp the true nature of Julian's blindness. It wasn't a weakness, as her family had assumed, a vulnerability to exploit. No, it was a strength, a heightened awareness that saw through sound, through scent, through the subtle vibrations of emotion that sighted people often overlooked. He heard the tremor in her voice, smelled the shift in her perfume, and felt the hesitation in her touch. And in realizing this, Dara felt a profound daydregs, a mix of admiration and dread. She was no longer just impersonating Penelope. She was unraveling under the gaze of a man who needed no eyes to pierce her soul. As the night wore on, the wind whispering secrets through the window, Dara clung to the edge of the bed, wondering how long she could endure before the truth clawed its way free. In the hushed corridors of the Harrington estate, where silence reigned like an invisible sovereign, Dara Adebayo found herself drawn into a quiet rebellion against the deception that had ensnared her. The weight of her secret pressed upon her like an unyielding fog, but in the midst of it, small acts of genuine care began to emerge, unbidden and tentative, as if her heart sought solace in authenticity amid the lies. She rose before dawn, the estate still cloaked in twilight's embrace, her bare feet padding softly across the cool marble floors toward the kitchen. The room, with its gleaming counters and array of utensils hanging like dormant instruments, felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could channel her turmoil into something tangible. Drawing from the discreet murmurs of the staff, who had observed Julian's preferences over the years, she set to work. Eggs poached to a delicate perfection, their yolks quivering like captured sunlight. Toast brown, just enough to crisp without charring. Coffee brewed black and strong, its aroma rising like a dark, invigorating mist. Her hands moved with a newfound purpose, steady despite the tremor in her soul, as she arranged the tray with care, adding a single sprig of fresh mint for a touch of unexpected vibrancy. Carrying the tray to the sunroom, where morning light filtered through expansive windows like threads of gold, Dara placed it on the low table with a gentle clink. Julian entered moments later, his steps unerring, guided by the subtle scents and sounds that painted his world. He paused, inhaling deeply, his head tilting as if composing an internal symphony from the aromas. "This smells different," he remarked, settling into his chair. Warmer somehow. Not the usual fare. Dara hesitated, her voice soft. I thought you might like a change. Something made with care. He didn't press further, but as he ate, a faint nod of approval escaped him. And for the first time, Dara felt a flicker of warmth pierce the chill of her isolation. Emboldened, she ventured next to his study, a room sealed in silence since the accident that had stolen his sight, its door like a forgotten tomb. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light as she entered, her heart pounding with the audacity of intrusion. Bookshelves lined the walls, volumes untouched and forlorn, their spines whispering tales of neglect. She dusted the desk with a soft cloth, rearranged the pen holder for easier reach, and aligned the scattered papers into neat stacks, her fingers lingering on the leather-bound journals that held echoes of his past life. It was a labor of quiet devotion, not for show, but for the man who navigated darkness with such grace. When Julian discovered the changes later that afternoon, his hand gliding over the polished wood of the desk, he froze. You've been in here, he stated, not accusingly, but with a note of surprise that bordered on wonder. She never stepped into this room, claimed it was too cluttered for her tastes. Dara's breath caught, but she met the moment head on. I know. I just wanted to make it a little more comfortable for you. A place where you could breathe easier. He said nothing then, his fingers curling tightly around the armrest of his chair. But the air shifted, charged with an unspoken acknowledgement that lingered like the afterglow of a setting sun. As the day waned, they ventured into the garden for the first time together, the breeze gentle and carrying the earthy perfume of blooming life. Julian allowed her to lead him without his cane, his arm linked through hers in a trust that made Dara's chest tighten with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The path wound through manicured beds, gravel crunching softly underfoot, and she described the flora with a poet's touch. Purple lavender swaying like dancers in the wind, white daisies nodding their heads in agreement, hydrangeas beginning to wilt, but still holding on to their faded blue petals. Her words painted vivid strokes in the canvas of his mind, and he listened without interruption, his face turned toward the sun's waning warmth. Then a question pierced the tranquility. You don't tell me about orchids anymore? It was a subtle probe, hearkening back to Penelope's scripted passions, the exotic blooms she had once described with detached elegance. Dara froze mid-step, the deception rearing its head like a shadow in the light. But she recovered, whispering with a sad smile he couldn't see. I thought maybe today the other flowers deserved to speak, the ones that bloom quietly without demanding attention. Julian's response was a smile, the first true one she'd witnessed, not peaceful, but edged with revelation, as if he were glimpsing a different soul through the veil of her words. It transformed his features, softening the proud lines of his jaw, and in that instant, Dara felt seen, not as Penelope's shadow, but as herself. Night fell with a soft amber glow filling the living room, the wind murmuring through open windows like a confidential ally. Dara sat beside him on the velvet sofa, a book cradled in her lap, not the lofty Shakespeare or brooding Bronte that Penelope had once recited with performative flair, but a gentle novel of quiet lives and subtle joys. Her voice filled the space, warm and unhurried, weaving the story's threads with a tenderness that surprised even her. Julian tilted his head, his breathing deepening as he absorbed the narrative, his hand resting inches from hers on the cushion. When she paused at the end of a chapter, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that resonated through her. Your voice, it's warmer. The way you touch me is softer. Even your silence feels different. He turned his face toward her, blind eyes unflinchingly direct in their intent. If you're someone else, he paused, the words hanging like a delicate bridge between them. I think I might like you more. Dara's heart pounded, a wild drumbeat in her chest. She set the book down, her hands tightening on the armrest to steady herself. Was this a confession or a gentle unveiling, a way of saying he knew without shattering the fragile peace? In that long, tender silence, something stirred, a flicker of care, a whisper of fear, an unnamed emotion blooming between two souls bound in this strange marriage, one who couldn't see and one who had never been truly seen. The room seemed to hold its breath, the fire crackling in the hearth like applause for this budding intimacy. Dara wanted to believe it was real, this pull toward staying, toward letting the mask slip just a fraction. The silence, once her enemy, now cradled possibilities, a fertile ground where affection could take root amid the thorns of deceit. Yet beneath it all, the risk loomed, knowing that one wrong word could uproot everything. As the evening deepened, she lingered in that moment, savoring the closeness, even as shadows of doubt danced at the edges of her mind. The old study in the Harrington estate stood as a bastion of forgotten solitude, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor in golden pools that glinted off empty picture frames. Dara Adebayo sat alone amid the quiet, her hands still dusted with the faint residue of polish from the morning's efforts. She had just finished tidying the space, wiping away layers of neglect that had accumulated like unspoken regrets. The air carried a faint scent of lemon wax, mingling with the musty aroma of leather-bound books that lined the walls like silent sentinels. For the first time, Dara allowed herself a moment of unguarded peace, stealing these precious minutes to simply be without the mask of Penelope, without the weight of deception pressing down like an iron yoke. The room, once a forbidden domain, now felt like a refuge, a place where she could exhale the breath she'd been holding since the wedding. The door burst open without a knock, shattering the tranquility like a thunderclap. No warning, no courtesy, just the sharp intrusion of heels striking the floor like the ticks of a doomsday clock. Penelope Sinclair strode in first, her blonde hair cascading in perfect waves, her porcelain skin flushed with a mix of annoyance and entitlement, as if the estate were her domain to claim. Behind her came their adoptive mother, Eleanor Sinclair, her presence a storm cloud of authority, lips pursed in that familiar line of disapproval. The air thickened instantly, charged with the electric tension of impending confrontation. Dara sat up straight, her heart leaping into her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm, fingers gripping the edge of the chair like anchors in a tempest. "We need to talk," Eleanor declared, her voice slow and venomous, slicing through the room like a blade honed for precision cuts. She didn't sit, neither did Penelope. Instead, they loomed over Dara, turning the study into a courtroom where she was both defendant and prisoner. Penelope didn't wait for pleasantries. She strolled around the room with predatory grace, her fingers grazing the wooden desk as if appraising stolen goods. She picked up a book idly, flipping its pages with disdain before tossing it back with a sharp thud that echoed like a gavel strike. "The thing is, you're getting a little too deep into character," she said, her tone laced with mocking sweetness. "The maids say you make breakfast for Julian, take him on walks, sit by his bed reading every night." She let out a laugh, sharp and hollow, shaking her head as if Dara were a child caught in a foolish game. "Seriously, Dara, dial it back. Did you forget who you're supposed to be pretending to be?" Dara remained silent at first, her eyes fixed on the floor, the familiar sting of submission rising in her chest. But something had shifted within her. The small acts of kindness, the moments shared with Julian, they had kindled a spark that refused to be extinguished. Eleanor cut in, her voice turning to ice, eyes narrowing like a predator sizing up prey. "You really think he's going to marry you again? He belongs to Penelope, to this family, not to you. You're a placeholder, Dara, nothing more." The words landed like blows, each one designed to wound, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy they'd imposed. But as Dara looked up, meeting their gazes for the first time with unflinching resolve, a quiet fire ignited in her core. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with a defiant rasp, her dark skin glowing under the sunlight as if drawing strength from its warmth. "He's not who you think he is," she said, her voice steady, though her hands clenched at her sides to hide the slight tremble. "Not some blind fool easy to manipulate." Penelope laughed again, loud and cruel, the sound reverberating off the walls like shattering glass. "Not who we think he is? What? Not a blind fool? Then what is he, Dara? Your knight in shining armor?" Her eyes sparkled with malice, enjoying the twist of the knife. Dara clenched the edge of her chair harder, drawing blood to her palms, but she didn't back down. "He's kind. He's perceptive. He deserves to be treated with decency, No matter who loves him. The words poured out, fueled by the memories of Julian's subtle smiles, his gentle questions, the way he listened as if her voice were the only light in his darkness. For the first time, she saw them not as unassailable authorities, but as architects of cruelty, their faces twisted in a rare moment of stunned silence. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, regarding Dara like a child spouting fairy tales. "You really think he cares about you?" Her voice dripped with condescension, turning colder still. "You're a placeholder, Dara. He doesn't know who you are. He loves Penelope, and if he finds out the truth, what do you think he'll do?" Penelope twisted the knife deeper, her smirk widening. "You think he'll forgive the woman who impersonated someone else? Or spit in your face for lying next to him under my name?" Dara pressed her lips together, her eyes burning but dry. No tears this time, only a resolute clarity. She stood taller, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. "If he finds out and chooses to walk away, I'll still know I did the right thing. Because at least I never treated him like a transaction." The declaration hung in the air, a bold challenge that froze the two women in place, their expressions flickering with shock. It was the first time Dara had ever fought back, her words a shield forged from the quiet intimacy she'd shared with Julian. For a heartbeat, the room pulsed with tension, the sunlight seeming to dim as if holding its breath. Then Eleanor spoke, her tone like a curse whispered in the dark. "Don't fool yourself into thinking this is love. You're borrowing a place that was never yours. And when I take it back, you won't have the right to cry." With that, they turned, the door slamming behind them with finality, the echo reverberating through the estate like the closing of a chapter. Dara stood still in the aftermath, her body trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of defiance. She had never spoken to them like that before, never dared to voice the truths bubbling within her. But the strangest part was the absence of regret. Instead, a quiet strength bloomed in her chest, rooting her to the spot. Yet as the silence settled once more, doubt crept in like shadows lengthening at dusk. If Julian knew everything, the impersonation, the lies, would he see her as a betrayer or as the only one who had offered him honesty amid the facade? The question gnawed at her, a single thorn in the garden of her newfound resolve. She wandered to the window, gazing out at the manicured lawns, her mind a tempest of worry and empowerment. In standing up to her family, she had claimed a piece of herself, but the cost loomed uncertain, a shadow over the fragile bonds she cherished. The study, once a haven, now felt like a crossroads, where her path diverged toward truth or ruin. The back veranda of the Harrington estate overlooked a garden bathed in the fading hues of sunset, where the last rays slanted through sheer curtains like fragile threads of hope unraveling at the edges. Dara Adebayo sat at the porch's edge, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, arms wrapped around them as if they were the only anchors keeping her from tumbling into the abyss churning within. The wind whispered through the swaying trees, carrying the faint scent of wilting hydrangeas and damp earth, but it offered no solace to the storm raging in her heart. Tears fell one by one, heavy and deliberate, like a heart no longer beating, but bleeding out its sorrows. Her mother's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, a cruel whisper in a locked basement. "You're just a second-rate copy. You don't get to love." She hadn't fought back as fiercely as she'd wanted, managing only a single defiant sentence about Julian's goodness, and even that had elicited laughter, as if her truth were a ridiculous jest. Bearing her head in her arms, Dara felt the fracture deepen, not a shattering quake, but a slow, quiet carving away at the last layers of trust she held dear. Behind her there came the faintest sound, a soft footfall on the wooden planks, deliberate yet unintrusive. She didn't need to turn. She knew it was Julian. He moved with that uncanny grace, his presence announced not by sight but by the subtle shift in the air, the way the veranda seemed to hold its breath in deference. He sat down beside her without a word, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not so close as to invade the fragile bubble of her grief. The silence stretched between them, not empty or awkward, but thick and weighty, laden with everything neither could yet articulate. It was a silence born of shared vulnerability, the kind that spoke volumes in its restraint. Dara's tears slowed, her breathing steadying in the rhythm of his own, as if his mere proximity were a balm soothing the raw edges of her pain. After what felt like an eternity, Julian's voice emerged, low and steady, cutting through the dusk like a lighthouse beam in fog. Have you ever wished you were someone else? The question pierced straight through her ribs, simple yet profound, laden with an empathy that made her chest ache. Dara lifted her head slightly, her voice a whisper choked with emotion. Yes, every day. The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, a confession she'd never voiced aloud before. It felt like shedding a layer of skin, exposing the tender vulnerability beneath. Julian nodded slightly without judgment, his blind eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Then he leaned in just a fraction, his hand reaching out tentatively to touch hers. Not to hold, but to connect, a feather-light brush that grounded her in the moment. If one day I get to see you, he paused as if savoring the weight of his words, tasting their implications. I'm afraid I won't want to look away. The statement was laced with a quiet intensity, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. And in that instant, Dara felt more seen than ever before, paradoxically, by a man who navigated the world in darkness. His touch lingered, warm and reassuring, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. She turned toward him, aching to meet a gaze that couldn't return her own, her throat burning with unspoken words that dissolved into mere breath. Julian didn't press for a response. He simply withdrew his hand slowly, standing with the same measured poise that defined him. The breeze tousled his blonde hair across his forehead, casting him in a silhouette against the dying light. You know, he said, his back to her now, his voice carrying on the wind, there are some things you can only see without your eyes. With that, he walked away, leaving Dara alone with the last traces of sunlight and a heart trembling on the precipice of something dangerously close to breaking free. Hope, perhaps, or the terrifying bloom of genuine affection. But Julian didn't retreat inside immediately. He lingered beneath the awning, his figure a sentinel in the gathering twilight, as if weighing a final revelation, debating whether to voice it or carry it into eternity unspoken. At last he turned slightly, not quite facing her, his voice stripped of armor, bare and resonant. Tomorrow I'm going to the hospital. Dara looked up, startled, her breath catching like a snag in silk. He continued, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, head bowed as if in quiet confession. There's a doctor in Switzerland, an experimental procedure. They say the odds aren't great, but there's hope. The words landed like a sudden gust, whipping through her thoughts and leaving her frozen. Dara opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. No blessing, no protest, because any utterance now would cut both ways, revealing too much or too little. Hope? The very word twisted in her gut, mingling with a rising tide of terror. Julian bowed his head further, his tone softening to something deeper than fear, laced with a faint, almost bitter smile. You know what scares me most? It's not that it might not work. He paused, the wind filling the gap with its mournful sigh. It's that I might open my eyes and no longer recognize the world I used to think was beautiful, because it turns out it wasn't what I imagined. With those words, he vanished into the dark interior of the estate, the door closing softly behind him like the end of a chapter left unresolved. Dara remained on the porch, the wind creeping across her shoulders, cold and sharp, whispering a devastating question into her ear. If he sees tomorrow, will he ever want to look at her again? The garden blurred before her eyes, the fading light painting everything in somber oranges and purples, a canvas of uncertainty. Julian's revelation hung over her like a storm cloud, pregnant with possibility and peril. The procedure, a beacon of restoration for him, yet a harbinger of potential rejection for her. What if his sight revealed not just the world, but the deception etched into her very being? The contrast of her dark skin against the image he'd built of Penelope's fair blonde perfection loomed like a specter. She hugged her knees tighter, the veranda now a lonely stage where her fears played out in vivid detail. The night deepened, stars emerging one by one, like distant witnesses, and Dara sat there, caught in the web of his words, her heart a tumultuous sea of longing and dread. In his vulnerability, Julian had offered her a glimpse of his soul, but it came at the cost of amplifying her insecurities, leaving her to grapple with the shadows of what might come. The wind carried her unspoken worries into the void, as the estate stood silent around her, a guardian of secrets yet to unfold. Time after the surgery crawled like pages in a book no one dared to turn, each day a deliberate pause in the narrative of their lives. Dara Adebayo remained steadfast by Julian Harrington's side, a constant presence in the sterile hush of the recovery room, where machines hummed like watchful guardians. She smiled less, spoke even less, her words measured against the terror gnawing at her core. The closer they inched toward the moment he might see again, the more she feared the unraveling of everything she'd come to cherish. The hospital air was thick with antiseptic and anticipation, sunlight filtering through blinds and slivers that mocked her anxiety. Birds chirped outside the window on that fateful morning, their songs a cruel symphony of normalcy, as if the world held its breath for a revelation that could shatter hers. The sky hung unusually clear, a vast blue expanse mirroring the clarity about to dawn. The recovery room glowed in pristine white, machines beeping softly like a prelude to judgment. Dara sat beside the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, cold and clammy. No trace of Celeste's makeup or Dior perfume. Just her, plain and bare. A woman teetering on the edge of truth, poised to lose a love she never intended to claim. Julian lay still, the final layers of gauze awaiting removal, his face calm yet etched with the subtle tension of the unknown. The doctor entered with measured steps, tools glinting under the fluorescent lights. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of miracles. With careful precision, the bandages unwound, revealing eyes that had dwelled in darkness for years. Julian kept them closed a moment longer, as if testing a long-dormant part of himself, then blinked slowly, light flooding in fiercely and immediately. He didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze swept the room, adjusting to the assault of colors and shapes. It stopped directly on Dara. She froze, breath trapped in her throat, her heart thudding wildly, chest aching from a hope she scarcely dared to harbor. But before words could form, chaos erupted. The door flew open with a bang, Penelope Sinclair bursting in like a whirlwind of entitlement, her blonde hair disheveled from haste, clad in a hastily donned bridal gown that screamed desperation. Eleanor trailed behind, her face a mask of calculated fury. They'd heard the news through whispered channels, the miracle of sight restored, and descended like vultures sensing weakness. "Julian!" Penelope cried, shoving past Dara, her voice a shrill command. "It's me, your true fiancé. This imposter has been fooling you all along." She positioned herself at the bedside, smiling with forced radiance, the gown's lace trailing like a mocking echo of their wedding day. Eleanor grabbed Dara's arm, yanking her back with venomous whispers. You're nothing now. Pretend to be my maid, serve us, and stay silent. I'll be his wife again." Dara stumbled, her world spinning, the humiliation burning like acid. Penelope leaned over Julian, cooing, "Darling, now that you can see, you'll know the truth. She's just a fraud, a black girl playing dress-up in my life." Julian sat up slowly, his newly awakened eyes, sharp, blue and unflinching, flickering with recognition, not surprise. He looked past Penelope's theatrical display, his gaze locking onto Dara once more. "You're not Penelope," he said, his voice quiet and measured, like a verdict long deliberated in the court of his mind. The words struck Dara like a physical blow, not to her face but to the fragile remnants of her self-preservation. She flinched, stepping back half a pace, hands clenched, lips trembling. Excuses flooded her mind, but they dissolved into hollow echoes. Tears welled, no longer silent but streaming freely, her body shaking not from shame alone, but from the terror that even after all they'd shared, she might prove unworthy. Penelope interjected, her voice rising in panic. "Julian, it's me! Right here! You're Penelope! This girl is a fake!" She clutched his arm, her bridal gown rustling absurdly, but Julian gently pried her fingers away, his expression unchanging. He shook his head, eyes never leaving Dara's. I've known for a long time. The revelation hung in the air, stunning the room into silence. Penelope's face drained of color, Eleanor's grip on Dara slackening in shock. From your voice, softer, with that gentle rasp. From the way you set the T on the left instead of the right. From how you say, I'm sorry, like no one's ever forgiven you before. His words unfolded like a tapestry of observations, each thread a subtle cue he'd woven into certainty during his blindness. I waited, he continued, his tone softening as he addressed Dara directly, to see if you could love me as a man, not just as the final role in your family's game. Dara collapsed inward, covering her face as sobs racked her frame, the weight of deception crashing down. Why? She choked out, her voice breaking like fragile glass. Why didn't you say something sooner? Why let me keep lying to you? Julian rose from the bed, every step closing the chasm between them, bridging the truth they'd both skirted. He stopped before her, lowering himself to her level, his hands gently cupping her face, wiping away the bitter tears with thumbs that trembled slightly from the emotion surging within. Because I was waiting to know if it was real. His eyes, newly born into light, still blurred at the edges but warmer than a spring dawn, met hers fully for the first time. Dara, he whispered, speaking her real name aloud, a sacred utterance stripped of disguise, infused with reverence. The sound of it broke her anew, but this time she didn't hide. She let him see the raw vulnerability, the love she'd buried under layers of pretense. Julian drew her into an embrace, light as a thread, yet tight enough to mend a fractured heart. I didn't love you because you reminded me of someone, he murmured into her hair. I loved you because you dared to be different, because you loved me when I had nothing to offer but blindness and loneliness. Penelope stood frozen at the bedside, her bridal gown now a ridiculous costume in the harsh light of rejection. She stammered, trying to reclaim the narrative. You were blind. You must have been confused. Now that you see me, you'll remember who you truly love. But Julian didn't glance her way, his focus unwavering on Dara. With a firm gesture, he summoned the staff, who escorted Penelope and Eleanor from the room, their protests fading into impotent echoes down the hallway. The irony silenced them. The woman who'd orchestrated the deception now cast out, her schemes crumbling like sandcastles against the tide. In the quiet aftermath, as the door clicked shut, Dara clung to Julian, the world narrowing to the rhythm of his heartbeat against hers. The truth, once a looming specter, now liberated them, forging a bond tempered in fire. Yet even in this embrace, a whisper of uncertainty lingered. What came next in a world where sight had rewritten their story? The room, once a chamber of secrets, now held the promise of revelation. But the full light of day awaited beyond its walls. In the misty mountains of Oregon, where pine forests cloaked the landscape like ancient guardians, and morning fog rolled over a crystal-clear lake like a lover's whispered secret, Julian Harrington and Dara Adebayo found their rebirth. They didn't call it escape. They named it renewal, a deliberate shedding of the old skin that had bound them in deception and darkness. The small center they established nestled beside the water's edge, its wooden sign hand-carved with simple, evocative words, the light from darkness. Here in this serene haven far from the opulent shadows of the Harrington estate, they built a life not on lies, but on the quiet truths they'd unearthed in each other's souls. Julian, once a blind millionaire shrouded in isolation, now taught music to sightless students, his fingers dancing over piano keys, his voice tender as he guided them through melodies felt rather than seen. He composed not just with notes, but with touch and resonance, transforming what he'd once dismissed as frivolous into a lifeline for others navigating the void. Dara, no longer a shadow impersonating her sister, led groups around the lake's winding pass, teaching them to sense the world through the symphony of sounds, the lap of water against stones, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the subtle sense of wildflowers blooming unseen. Her dark skin glowed under the dappled sunlight, her laughter unburdened as she encouraged her charges to trust the rhythm of their hearts. No one here whispered of Julian's wealth. They called him the man who could see in the dark, a title earned through his empathy, his stories of love found in blindness. Together they wove a tapestry of healing, their marriage no longer a facade but a partnership forged in fire. Julian's sight a gift that illuminated not just the world, but the depth of Dara's unwavering devotion. Evenings found them by the lakeside, hands intertwined, watching sunsets paint the water in fiery hues, their conversations drifting from shared dreams to the simple joy of being truly known. It was a beginning unmarred by pretense, where love bloomed wild and resilient, like ferns pushing through rocky soil. Yet across the country, in a luxurious villa in Florida, where palm trees swayed under relentless sun and the air hummed with the buzz of political ambition, Penelope Sinclair faced the cruel twist of fate's ironic blade. She had married a young senator, handsome, driven, with eyes that sparkled like campaign promises, and a future as bright as the spotlights he craved. Their wedding had been a spectacle of glamour, filled with influential guests and toasts to power and prosperity. But life, ever the master storyteller, wove in its own dark thread. A car accident, sudden and unforgiving, had robbed him of his sight, plunging him into the same shadows Julian had once inhabited. Now Penelope's days revolved around the minutiae of cares she had once scorned as beneath her, brewing his tea with precise measurements, selecting shirts from his wardrobe with the aid of a fashion assistant who hovered like a paid confidant, and describing sunsets in vivid detail to a man who could no longer behold them. Each morning as she placed the cup in his trusting hands, he would murmur, "You're the light of my life," his voice sweet and adoring, blind to the chasm widening within her. Penelope smiled then, a practiced curve of her lips that fooled him utterly. But in the privacy of her vanity mirror, that smile always faltered, ending in the faintest curl of bitterness, a silence as long as forgotten regrets. She had orchestrated deceptions with ease, manipulating lives like pieces on a chessboard. But now irony mocked her at every turn. The caregiver role she had thrust upon Dara now hers to bear. The blindness she had exploited in Julian echoed in her husband's plight. Her ambitions, once tied to his rising star, now dimmed in the routine of dependency. Her days a performance for an audience of one who couldn't see the cracks in her facade. One morning as she sat at her vanity applying a touch of red lipstick out of old habit, a ritual from days when appearances were weapons, her assistant's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speaker. In today's headlines, entrepreneur Julian Harrington has been awarded the International Humanitarian Award for his work with the blind community, alongside his wife, Dara Adebayo. Penelope's hand froze, the lipstick trembling in her palm like a fragile truce shattered. The names hit her like a wave. Julian, thriving; Dara, elevated from placeholder to partner. A second later, she laughed quietly, not with bitterness or sharpness, but a dry, brief sound, as if something deep within had plummeted into an abyss of self-reckoning. She set the lipstick down, poured the tea for her husband, and leaned in close as she handed it to him, whispering soft enough for the wind to carry away, yet never soft enough for a heart to forget. "I'm not the light, my love. I'm just the shadow who stood in the wrong place. Love does not punish, but it never forgets. And in the end, those who love truthfully see clearly, while the pretenders perform forever, until no audience remains to believe their illusions." Back in Oregon, as mist blanketed the pines and sunlight visited like an old gentle friend, Julian and Dara continued their work, their center a beacon for the lost. Students arrived daily, drawn to the couple's story whispered in circles of the visually impaired, a tale of deception redeemed by genuine connection, of sight regained not just in eyes but in hearts. Julian's music lessons resonated with deeper meaning, each note a testament to resilience. Dara's walks by the lake became journeys of self-discovery, her guidance infused with the empathy of one who had walked in shadows herself. Their love, once fragile and hidden, now stood unassailable, a quiet force that inspired all who crossed their path. As evenings fell, they would sit by the fire, Julian's hand in Dara's, reflecting on the irony that had shaped them, the blindness that had revealed true vision, the deception that had birthed authenticity. Penelope's world, meanwhile, shrank to the confines of her villa, her husband's calls for her light a daily reminder of the darkness she'd sown. In this grand tapestry of fate, the threads converged, redemption for some, reckoning for others. And as the lake's waters rippled under starlight, Dara and Julian embraced their new chapter, where every dawn promised not just light, but the profound beauty of being seen and loved for who they truly were. Thank you for walking this journey with Dara and Julian to the very end. If this story touched something in your heart, leave a comment or simply share it to let this light travel further. And if you'd like to follow more stories that just might make your heart break beautifully, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because who knows, the next story might be yours. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey with Dara and Julian, a tale of deception, discovery, and true love that reminds us how the unseen can reveal the deepest truths. If this story resonated with you or sparked any thoughts on love, identity, or second chances, we'd love to hear them. Share your reflections in the comments below. Your insights make these narratives even more special. Don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that tug at the heartstrings, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in the light that shines from within. See you soon.